Well, hey there, it's Michael Osinski.
And it's also Tyler Esselman.
And you are listening to This One Goes to 11.
This One Goes to 11 is our podcast, where we invite someone on each week to make their case for what they believe is a perfect album.
So perfect that 10 out of 10 just isn't good enough.
One more in-person recording for
I know. And then you go back to LA, I go back to almost Canada. And we'll do this
pseudo Canada.
Yes. And we'll do this all over Zoom again.
Once more until we return to the National High School Theater Institute.
No, it's not the name of it. It's not. Just call it Cherubs.
Cherubs.
Just call it Cherubs.
But we got one more, and it's been a really great couple weeks. Seeing friends. We got to see a bunch of our friends of the pod and eat some pizza together, which was a great time. And it's just, it's feels good to see people in real life every now and then.
I know.
Yeah.
Actual physical, like I'm touching Tyler's shoulder right now.
It's underrated. Him touching my shoulder is an underrated thing. But we got an excellent guest that's just chock full of stories and amazing tidbits, and I think you all are going to enjoy this one. Michael, who are we talking to today?
We are talking to Michael Fosberg. For the past 20 years, Michael has been utilizing an autobiographical one-man play as a means to foster thought-provoking dialogue surrounding issues of race and identity in the DEIB space for corporations, government agencies, law firms, associations, and educational institutions. Prior to that, he worked as an actor, writer, director, and teacher, most recently at Northwestern University's National High School Institute, is what it's called, Tyler. In 2011, he published his memoir, Incognito, An American Odyssey of Race and Self-Discovery, and he followed that in 2020 with a book about his DEIB journey titled Nobody Wants to Talk About It, Race, Identity, and the Difficulties in Forging Meaningful Conversations.
Ooh.
Michael, welcome to This One Goes to 11. How you doing?
Hey, it's good to see you guys in person. This is really great. I love this. Yeah. It's so standard to do it by Zoom, but it's so nice to be in person.
Oh yeah. Also podcaster, so
yes.
You have you know this life.
I know the Zoom podcasting life. Yes. Indeed.
Yeah. Good titles on your things. You got you title things.
Thank you. Titles are important, aren't they?
Yes.
They are, including the title of the album we're going to talk about today.
Oh my goodness. Yeah.
Well, you set it right up for us.
Yeah.
So Michael, for those who don't read, tell us, what album hath thou brought before the tribunal today?
Kind of Blue by Miles Davis.
And it's kind of good, this album. This was on the list of albums that I think we were waiting for somebody to bring, and was very glad to see it on your list. So if you've never heard of Miles Davis, we'll go ahead and just put a bunch of question marks right by that, because it's a little crazy to think that somebody wouldn't know that name and wouldn't know this album, but. Just in case one of our listeners hasn't heard of Miles or Kind of Blue, we do have a very convenient feature that will allow them to get up to speed. Michael, what's that feature called?
It's called The Beginner's Guide to Miles Davis's Kind of Blue in 60 seconds.
And I'm doing it.
Yeah.
And I don't feel confident about this one. I don't. But as you, Michael, as if you've listened to the pod before, you're going to know that you're going to be making your case very strongly. But this is your chance to assess me and my job, condensing down the story of this man and this album into 60 seconds. So. Don't pull any punches, okay?
Got it.
Okay, cool. I'm ready.
Okay, 60 seconds on the clock. 3, 2, 1, go.
I don't care how ardent a Philistine you might be, when you hear the word jazz, the name Miles Davis surely can't be far behind. Born in Alton, Illinois, and then raised in East St. Louis, by the age of 12, music, and more specifically the trumpet, had become young Davis's entire life. His voracious appetite to improve his musical chops led him to train with prominent musicians in the St. Louis area, but the allure of getting up on the stage for real already had its hooks in him. After a brief, often truant chapter at Juilliard, Davis struck out into the legendary New York jazz scene and didn't look back. His early years were marked by collaborations with many of the other most famous jazz names filed away in your brain, primarily adhering to the chord-based hard bop that reigned supreme at the time. But it wasn't long before Davis's voice began to outgrow that style's rigid structure. He hungered for a musical direction that would open his creative gates. Enter modal jazz, the musical philosophy that would underpin his 1959 opus Kind of Blue. 45 minutes of rich, vapory, enveloping tunes that would cement Davis's status as not only one of the most innovative musicians in jazz, but let's face it, one of the most important, influential figures in the history of music itself.
Beautiful. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we were talking about this off mic before we started, and I think it's so difficult to sum. It's impossible to sum up Miles Davis in 60 seconds.
Yeah.
Because there are so many controversies around Miles Davis. Yeah. I compared him to Pablo Picasso, an artist who changed his styles constantly changing his styles. And Miles did that as well. Even though he's most famous for jazz, he was trying to infuse jazz into rock and roll, and then obviously hip hop. Ended up in the hip hop field. And he also was very controversial because he beat his girlfriends and wives. Yeah. Picasso has that notch in his belt as well. And so it's difficult to sum all of that up in 60 seconds. But,
right.
You did a good job.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. I mean, it's something that I think we're endeavoring to look at these people and these bands and these figures and all of their different shades as much as possible in the course of an hour.
Yeah.
And that, that endeavor is kind of enough, but also it's a chance for us to kind of like view them through the lens of ourselves, right? And like what we connect with about those people. So to that end, Michael, why don't you tell us a little bit more about kind of what your relationship has been with music over the course of your life? Big, small, writ large. That's all.
Okay, here we go. You ready for this ride?
I'm ready.
We are ready.
Let's do it. So interestingly enough, I was thinking a lot about this as we talked beforehand about the questions you'd be asking me. And I thought about when I first started listening to music, my mom was really into music and she went to hear some really incredible people, not just musicians, but also comedians and politicians. She heard Che Guevara speak. She really? Saw Lenny Bruce the night before he was arrested in Chicago at Mr. Kelly's. And she saw all kinds of different jazz bands and whatnot. And she had some of those albums. However, when she married my stepfather, he did not listen to music. As a matter of fact, he hated music. So I got the influence from my mom to like music, and I started off in a really corny way by, well, I don't know if it's so corny, but I loved the Jackson 5. I was totally into the Jackson 5. I loved Chicago, which I kind of hate to admit. Nice. The Temptations were one of my big fans, and James Brown. I was totally into James Brown stuff, but I couldn't play the albums in my house because what would happen was my dad would come home from work and he would come upstairs into my room and he would take the needle off the record player.
Dang. And
so that was my first, entry into music and how it antagonized my family or my household. And then and I guess I would say, just like most kids, when you tell them not to do something, what do? They do
it.
They go for it,
right? They go for it in a big way, right? Exactly. Yeah. So
double down.
I doubled down and I got really into music, taking me to college at the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis, and there I found myself working for a kosher caterer by the name of Hartley Frank, who somehow decided it was in his best interest to buy a nightclub in downtown Minneapolis called the Longhorn. It used to be a steakhouse. Naturally. And turned it into a punk club, which he knew nothing about. But he had me and my roommate at the time, Monty, and I ran the club pretty much. And we took care of, well, we didn't book the bands and things like that, but we kind of ran the logistics and the operations of the club. We'd clean it, we'd make sure it was staffed and do all this stuff. We'd take care of the bands. And so I took care of bands like Blondie, David Johansen from the New York Dolls, the Talking Heads.
Oh my God, Michael, come on.
The Suicide Commandos. I don't know if you remember, that was a great punk band from Minneapolis. And then, of course, Prince was around during those days as well. And I worked both at the Longhorn, I worked at this other shop called March 4th, where Prince, before he was really Prince, used to come in and shop. And we had like all kinds of punk items and punk clothing. And he would buy his stuff there. And he would test it out on stage at First Avenue in Minneapolis. And so that was sort of my entry into the music world. And, it just continued to flourish from there.
Did you have actual conversations with Prince?
We spoke in the store. I can't say like I knew
More, it
Prince.
was just like about the garment he may have.
Oh yeah,
that sort of thing.
or about
Okay.
things that he was shopping for, or things like
Okay.
that. Yeah, it wasn't like, hey, Prince. I mean,
Yeah.
and then again, this was before. I mean, I think his name was Prince Rogers. Was his
Prince Rogers
real
Nelson.
name?
Mhm.
This was really before he was. He hadn't put out. Is it the first album Soft and Wet? Is that the first album, or is that the single on the first album? I can't remember. But
I will Google.
he hadn't put out the first album yet.
Okay.
But he was working on all this stuff. And I knew two of my friends were close with him, and they all sort of congregated around the Children's Theater Company of Minneapolis at the time.
Yeah.
And so they all kind of were working together. And
what a hotbed.
Yeah, it was a hotbed of music.
You were kind of at in a sort of crucible of like really important music and stuff there. That's a lot of stuff. What was that album?
First album was called For You.
For You.
First single was called Soft and Wet.
Single was Soft and Wet. That's right. That's right.
What do you remember about like the spirit of that time? Like, was it I guess like when you talk about a scene in a particular place, right? Like we'll talk about New York. We'll talk about New York in Davis's time, but like, what was the spirit of Minneapolis at that time? Was it collaborative? Was it competitive? Like, how would you characterize it?
I would characterize it as very adventurous because there was a lot of, again, it was during the punk and new wave period, and so there was a lot of stuff going on. When I worked for March 4th, at that time they had this big sort of new wave punk convention, which seems kind of antithetical to punk music.
It's kind of corporate.
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah, it sounds very corporate.
Yeah.
But Devo played, but they couldn't play as Devo, so they played as Dove.
Oh,
And then
brilliant.
a Scottish punk band called Monochrome Set played. I don't even remember all the other bands, but they were like all these different bands, and they played. I mean, it was like a festival, I guess is a better way to put it.
Sure.
But we had booths up all around the stadium where we were in, and we had March 4th had a booth with all this punk stuff and stuff. So getting back to the idea of adventurous, it just felt like there were so many people trying new things at that time. I know the Suicide Commandos is not like the household name, but that band was like a huge punk band in Minneapolis, and they made a huge impact. And there were others there as well. Twin Tone Records came from Minneapolis, and they put out a lot of great albums by punk bands at the time, new wave bands. And so it was a really coal place to be around at that time.
So do you kind of have invoked punk, and punks come up on the pod a fair amount, just like, as a notion, as an ethos. And
has anyone chosen a punk album for your podcast?
Well, coming up this later this season, we have something.
Yeah,
it might be considered punk, although I think people might argue about whether it is.
Sure,
we'll
and
play it later.
Yeah. I guess that to me, we're talking about jazz, and we're kind of talking about this experimentation, this spirit of adventurousness. Like, is that sort of is adventure like? What is punk to you? I guess having experienced it the way that you did.
It sort of hit you over the head, or at least it hit me over the head. I felt like it was just this raw, visceral, just partly angry, but just all out assault on your ears, on your body. You could just feel it in you. It was so aggressive in so many ways. And then, of course, it's sort of tinged with new wave, which wasn't as aggressive, but utilizing music in a very, I guess what they were trying to look at is a futuristic way. I mean, you think about bands like Devo.
Yeah.
I mean, it was a very futuristic way to use instrumentation and singing. The B-52s were part of that new wave thing. So at the time, I felt like it was just so exciting and so different and so unique. I suppose the same could be said when people were first experimenting with jazz, Miles Davis, or with other forms of music as well. But that to me at that time, because it was such an assault on you, that it just felt so vibrant.
Yeah, love that.
All right. Well, hard pivot, Michael. Here we're talking about punk, but we're wondering now. So where did Miles Davis's Kind of Blue pop up in your musical experience? Like, how did you discover this album, this musician? Where did it all come from?
Yeah, well, it's interesting you're talking about Punk and Miles Davis because they're not the same at all.
No,
And Miles did not try punk, as far as I know.
Yeah.
Although
Punk in his own way.
Although I will say, yeah, some of his stuff is way out there. It's
Yeah.
really, really different.
Mhm.
And I wouldn't call it punk, but it was really different. So I think, I don't know this for a fact. I was a cherub, you know this, right?
Mhm. Yep.
So
Mhm.
the National High School Institute, which we have spoken about affectionately on this broadcast, on this podcast, I was in that program when I was a junior, between my junior and senior year in high school.
Beautiful.
Okay.
Yeah.
And it was a much, much smaller program. This campus was very different. This room was not here. This
Yeah.
building was not here.
Yeah.
But there was a building for the theater arts, and it was on the lake. It was before the landfill was actually there. And there was a room in that building that overlooked the lake. It had a wall of glass, a wall of windows, and then all of these like modular chairs and beanbag chairs, speakers up in the four corners of the room. And I took a class by, I think he was the chairman of the theater department at the time, John Williams, I think was his name. And he taught this class called aesthetics.
Cool.
I don't know what the hell that means.
I'd take the hell out of that class. Yeah.
I don't know. It must have been one of my electives. I don't remember. There were only 60 of us in the program at that time. And now there are 120 something.
They got double that right now.
Nice.
Yeah.
Exactly. And it's been larger than that in the past.
Certainly
Anyway,
has.
so what we did was we'd go in that room for 45, 50 minutes, and we would sit in the beanbag chairs or lie down on the floor or look out the window,
Mhm.
and he would put on music blaring loud out of this quadraphonic stereo system, and he would just have you observe life and nature.
Mm.
And I want to say that's where I first heard, I think, pretty much Blue and Green. I want to say I first heard it there.
Mm.
I can't be sure of that. It seems to me that I remember that class so well. It really cemented my love for music. And then, as Michael knows, I directed a lot here. I did, I don't know, 12 or 15 shows over years. I taught here. And music, I started with music. So I'd choose a script, but while I was choosing the script, music was always right there. Like, oh, I want this music to drive this scene or to move this moment or be this emotion or to underscore this, to support that or whatever. And I think that class really, really pushed it for me. And then the next time I remember hearing it was I came back to Chicago after college, and I got involved with an ensemble company called the Huron Theater Company. There were about a dozen of us.
Mm-hmm.
And we decided to produce the John Osborne play, Look Back in Anger.
Ooh,
and I got to play Jimmy Porter. And Jimmy Porter played the trumpet. And I don't play the trumpet. But they rigged up this thing on the set so that they had this scrim, and I could stand behind the scrim, and I had the trumpet in my hand, and I sort of, synced it with what was being played.
Yeah.
Miles Davis.
There you go.
So,
you could do worse than that.
Was
Yeah.
something from this album, or
it was something from Kind of Blue.
Oh wow.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it was So What.
Yeah. That tracks.
Yeah.
That class sounds like simultaneously like total hippy dippy, like ooh, like kind of woo woo, and also amazing. Like I think about the way that I listened to music when I was little, when I discovered what it felt like to really play something blaringly loud, such that it just takes over your being, and that sounds like I would have like eaten that up.
Yeah. Well, so we'd listen, and he would play different tracks of music. It wouldn't be like the whole album or whole track for the class. But then the last, 20 minutes or 15 minutes or so, we would talk about it. We'd talk about what we saw, what we felt, what moved us, what changed when you heard that track, this track. So yeah, it was really great. It was a great class.
And so did the discovery of this album was kind of the entry point to Miles's larger body of work, or was it sort of slower?
It was much slower, actually. I don't remember picking up on Miles after that. I don't really think it happened until I got to college and I heard more variety of music when I was in college. And again, I was exposed to a lot of punk music at the time.
Yeah, you were busy.
But I got exposed to some Miles Davis then, and then the broader spectrum of his body of work after college. So.
Real quick before we keep going down that track, you pretended to play trumpet.
Yes.
Were you making any music at all? Like, have you ever have you
I do. Well, I don't play anymore about it. I used to play the guitar, and
nice.
when I was in grade school, I played the clarinet. I don't know
Okay.
why, but
Yeah.
I really was into. Well, I'll tell you why. Actually, I'm just remembering this now. For some reason, I really got hooked on a Benny Goodman tune
There you go.
as a kid in sixth grade.
Yeah.
I just loved the clarinet that he was playing.
And nobody played it like him.
Nobody played it like him, and so I
Right.
started to play the clarinet, and then we had this assembly. The seventh grade, the eighth grade, the sixth grade, seventh grade, eighth grade,
Oh, yeah.
and the parents come and all that stuff. And I told my parents that I would meet them out in the lobby after after the sixth grade played. And went out into the lobby, and I was standing around. And they weren't there, and the seventh grade was playing, and then the eighth grade played. And then I looked down the hall, and the doors to the building come swinging open, and my parents come running in, and they're like, "Oh, they missed it."
Oh, God.
Oh, no.
I was crushed.
Oh, no. I was so good. What a shame.
Yeah.
Hey, their loss.
Yeah,
That's
they're
what I
lost.
say. It's well, we were talking about is Miles punk, and I think, you hear all these different definitions of it, but like I think something about being bad at music, being bad at play, like the kind of lack of polish.
Yeah.
I think is maybe where he misses out, because where he misses out on that punk tag, right? It doesn't feel so DIY
Yes.
as other things that are more self-consciously punk are. With Miles, it's sort of more in the Prince realm of that sort of obsessive technical
Yes.
musicianship in that way.
Yes. I mean, he did have what I call, I guess I call it dissonant jazz, which I actually don't have a very high tolerance for.
Yeah.
I can't. I prefer much more melodic jazz.
Yeah.
Bop, hard bop, cool jazz, modal is what he played for this album. But he did have that dissonant jazz period, and I call that the kind of music that other musicians love, but that normal people kind of go, "What?"
Yeah. Which I think is interesting. When I was reading this, I did, and corroborate this or tell me if I'm wrong, is that Ornette Coleman kind of came on the scene right at about the same time
Yes.
that this album was coming out,
Yes.
with a very kind of claiming free jazz,
free jazz
as this modality, and that kind of pissed Miles off, I guess, because he felt like it was stepping on his thing. He was stepping on, like, I've got this new way,
Yeah, well, and Sonny Rollins kind of detoured from bebop and hard bop to free jazz.
Yeah.
And Sonny Rollins was a contemporary of his as well, and he found that a little bit hard to understand. So.
Yeah.
It's just funny to hear you both sort of talking about Miles Davis as anywhere connected to dissonant jazz. And I know you said he had phases throughout.
Yeah.
I guess I just always associate someone like Coltrane as being leaning more into the dissonance than, and I know 0.5, maybe 0.05% of anything about jazz, but I feel like that's the one thing that I always took away was when I think of the word jazz, I think Miles Davis instantly. And frankly, this album, I think a lot of people who think they don't know Miles Davis actually do know this album. They just don't know they know it. Like, I don't know. Coltrane always struck me, who plays on this album,
right?
Always struck me as the guy who was really I don't know, fucking shit up a little bit more.
Yeah.
Is that, am I reducing things down a little bit there?
No, I mean, actually, I have an album of a tour that they did. I think it's in France. Miles Davis and Coltrane. It was the last time they played together. It was in 1960, early 1960, and you can hear in that Coltrane was done. You can hear it in the tracks. Well, done being, I don't want to say nice, but done playing along with this. He was moving on to more freer jazz, and he was also sort of frustrated. And there was, I mean, this is a weird period. So, I don't know if you want to get into this and talk about this now, but
why not? Yeah.
So the album was released in August, early August 15th of 1959. And then on August 25th of 1959, Miles was playing at Birdland, and he was playing a troops, a concert for American forces that they were recording. And he came outside to smoke a cigarette and to walk a woman to a taxi cab, and he was beaten by police officers on the street,
Mm-hmm.
beaten terribly. And people talk about this a lot. I was reading some about this the other day. It really changed him greatly.
Yeah.
He became much more bitter. And he wasn't a big talker to begin with, but he talked less. He went into this phase where he didn't actually create any new music of his own for another 4 or 5 years.
Yeah.
So it really changed his trajectory. And right after that, so this is the end of '59, Coltrane said, "I'm leaving."
Yeah.
And so, that's the tour that I'm talking about, that they took that last tour, and Coltrane didn't really want to go, but he'd already signed up for it before that. He decided he was going to leave. So he was really going off into free jazz, as you mentioned, at that point.
Okay.
Yeah. And I don't think it's reductive in the sense that I think there was a lot of, to what you were talking about, the Picasso sort of analogy.
Yeah.
I think there's the evolution of, even within each of these guys, sort of like album to album, the different modes in which they're playing, I think is stark enough that they were trying very specific kind of entryways into the record. Like this was, in a lot of ways, I think when we talk about albums, like it kind of feels defining of the concept of albums in that way.
Yeah.
It's the largest selling album of all time, I believe, or jazz album of all time.
I think it's jazz. I think I remember when we talked about, funny story, when we covered Vince Guaraldi, Charlie Brown Christmas. I believe that is the second. I think Charlie Brown Christmas is the second best-selling jazz album of all time, behind Kind of Blue. I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And you
Google that too.
Good. Yeah. And then the other thing is that then you get, after this sort of modal thing that that Coltrane was involved with, you got A Love Supreme coming on, coming a few years after that, which
That's
I think is taking, and even I feel like Miles did get into his version of free jazz later on, like the kind of more jazz fusion area was. I guess it maybe wouldn't be properly Ornette Coleman kind of free jazz, but it was more like the Miles version of that.
Right.
It's kind of what that feels like.
Yes, I would agree. That's kind of. I mean, we're kind of getting in the weeds for those people who don't listen to jazz. I mean, I guess I want to
also say I also don't know shit about jazz, but this is just like the small amount that I know. It's like it just tells you what you don't know. Right, like when you learn something, it's the tip of the iceberg.
I have a lot of jazz albums on vinyl. I brought the original Kind of Blue
Show
here.
and tell.
But I know a fraction, and I listen to it constantly, and I love it. It just feel like I'm learning more every time I'm listening to it.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess I would say in this album in particular, whether it was the largest selling jazz album of all time, which it is indeed.
It is, yeah.
I feel like, to me, it's like a soundtrack of my life.
Yeah.
Like when and the track, we haven't got to this, but the track that I love the most.
This
is Blue and Green.
Blue and Green, yeah.
And for me, I can sit down, put that track on, and it just takes me away emotionally. Yeah. Like it hits me to the core emotionally. And it can be slightly different emotions. I think most of the time it feels very melancholy, but it also can feel very uplifting. It can feel very somber. So it has all these different modes of emotions that come up in me when I hear that particular track. But the entire album, like I can just listen to it over and over. One of the albums I never even talked about with you guys that I think I've listened to more than anything except for this is a Brian Eno album.
Oh, which one?
Called Music for Films.
No,
I'm sorry, not Music for Films. Music for Airport.
I've heard that one. Oh, yeah.
I know Music
They
for
actually used to play it at O'Hare Airport in the tunnel that goes in underneath between A and B, where they have all the neon stuff going on. But people complain. They're like, "What is this?" Like, yeah, okay.
It's literally music for airports, people.
Literally. But that music, to me, it can just take me away someplace. Like it. Like, and again, I like all different kinds of music, but to be taken away by something, if you were asking me, what is it about music that really gets me? It's taking me someplace. It's taking me on a journey. And the Brian Eno album, along with This Kind of Blue, just really do that.
So before we get, we're talking about standards for perfection already. We have a schedule to keep, Michael. Okay. So you said blue and green. Blue and green is your standout track.
Yeah.
All right. If you've never heard it before, people, this is what that sounds.